I don't think it's a bold claim to make that Donkey Kong Country Returns is one of the most underrated platformers of all time. And I believe most Nintendo fans can agree that the Donkey Kong Country series is a top contender for the best atmosphere in retro and modern gaming. Even from the series' inception in the 90s, when David Wise created a video game piece so iconic, multiple generations of Nintendo fans can recognize it just from the first few seconds. This song, and many others composed by David Wise, became one of the most unique styles of any video game soundtrack ever created, which funnily enough was all due to the limitations of the SNES only having 64 kilobytes of memory for soundtracks. Now sure, there were many other factors that led to Rare's successful platforming series, such as the iconic worlds, unique gameplay, tons of hidden collectibles to find, minecart levels that made you want to rip your hair out, and King K. Rool, who without even a single modern appearance other than Mario Super Sluggers for the Wii, still made it into Smash Bros. Ultimate. All of these factors led to the creation of a die-hard Donkey Kong Country fanbase, but nobody could have ever foreseen Microsoft acquiring Rare in September of 2002. With the series already in a dry spell, this unfortunately put the beloved series into a fully dormant state for over a decade. Nintendo now had to search for a replacement developer since they could no longer work with a competitor. Why Nintendo never had the idea of striking a deal with Rare, as they were absolutely carrying the N64 during one of Nintendo's driest times as a company, we may never know. But it wasn't quite over for Donkey Kong Country yet, because a new developer had finally entered the ring after previously reviving another one of Nintendo's struggling series, Retro Studios. Retro was originally founded in September of 1998 as an alliance between Nintendo and Iguana Entertainment's founder, Jeff Spangenberg. Jeff was a self-taught programmer who skipped college in pursuit of a programming career. After 8 years of managing the company, he was eventually fired from Iguana due to Acclaim acquiring Iguana, with swift management changes taking place soon after, which then motivated him to find other developers not currently working at Iguana in pursuit of creating a new company. After the creation of Retro was finalized, and a strong team of developers was established, Nintendo hoped with Retro's partnership that they could create exclusive mature games for the GameCube. Nintendo chose Spangenberg specifically due to his previous endeavors with Iguana, including the Turok series on the N64, a first-person shooter revolving around a Native American warrior trying to stop an alien threat, which also includes dinosaurs for some reason. Apparently the game was actually quite difficult with its platforming, which gave Tomb Raider a run for their money. Turok ended up being Acclaim's only hope of revenue at one point, receiving critical acclaim across the board as being one of the most successful N64 games and continuing to evolve the first-person shooter genre. But going back to Retro, the team was given a green light and immediately got to work on 4 new projects, all of which would eventually be cancelled. This was due to the high demand of a single project that would change this Nintendo series and Retro Studios forever. With Nintendo primarily being known for their family-friendly titles like Mario, Kirby, Pokemon, Zelda, for the most part, what mature Nintendo series would be in dire need of another studio to fully utilize the IP correctly? The answer was pretty simple: Metroid. This series undoubtedly was going through a rough period after the release of Super Metroid in 1994, which was a really amazing game in its own right, but Metroid just never seemed to break out into a more general audience until 2002, when Retro Studios released one of Nintendo's most beloved series to date, Metroid Prime. Nintendo's first FPS was finally here, which is funny because Nintendo still doesn't even consider that term. They prefer the term first-person adventure. Dog, I could go on a first-person adventure outside for free instead of playing this, so let's just call it what it is. Okay, but in all seriousness though, this game sold insanely well. well. It was one of the highest selling games on the GameCube, with 2.8 million copies worldwide on a system that was in desperate need of sales. Even without a sales record to back up its critical acclaim, Prime still received universal praise from reviewers and gamers alike. It was also nominated for many Game of the Year awards, in the end being beaten out by Grand Theft Auto, Vice City, but in other conferences like the Game Developer Choice Awards, Prime won in 3 separate categories, with those being Game of the Year 2003, Rookie Studio of the Year, and Excellence in Level Design. The truly ahead of its time graphics combined with the mechanics surrounding more exploration than action all fit into the Metroid series incredibly well. The 2D games were also heavily focused on exploration as well, having to explore and find the upgrades required to progress. Nowadays, sure, you could easily whip out your phone and frantically type the question to the point where Google has no idea what the you're talking about. But back then, it was either buy our book or go find the upgrade yourself, loser. Those mechanics have since been removed and been replaced by even worse mechanics like yellow paint everywhere, holding your hand the whole game, or just pin everywhere you need to go. But I'm getting off track here. After Retro completed and released not 1, not 2, but an entire trilogy of Metroid Prime, Retro was finally allowed to let off the gas and go home to see their families. Except Nintendo had different plans. Miyamoto had been receiving information from North American Nintendo fans that a new Donkey Kong Country game was highly requested. Tanabe then suggested that Retro Studios would absolutely be a worthy candidate with how well they treated the Metroid series and its lore. And why not, right? They just finished creating an entire trilogy, which was basically one big love letter to the entire Metroid series. But would they be able to shift that focus from a dark, mature 3D first-person shooting exploration to a colorful 2D monkey trying to save his precious bananas? Yes. And they blew it out the water. Donkey Kong Country Returns is definitely one of my favorite video games of all time. Not because it just so happened to be one of the first video games I had ever played at the age of 5, but now I can really appreciate it for everything it brought to the table of 2D platformers in that era. One of its claim to fame gimmicks that was barely even mentioned in the marketing was that it was a 2.5D game. Where does the 0.5 come from, you might ask? Well, it's not exactly a 3D space by any means. However, they did add the feature to traverse the foreground and the background of a level. This opened up tons of new possibilities for platforming, which was later adopted by Nintendo and implemented into their own premier platforming series, Mario. Sure, it took all the way till Mario Wonder, but they did it. They finally added something Retro did 13 years ago. Let's all give a round of applause for Nintendo, guys. They're learning! But enough about Mario. Let's talk about the story. And as with all Nintendo games, this is going to be very brief. A normal day on Donkey Kong Island goes incredibly wrong when the volcano decides enough is enough, somehow becomes sentient, and decides to spawn these random ass tikis, which after gaining any sort of free will, immediately goes and tries to control the masses. That's a great message to teach the kids, Retro. Anyways, these goofy looking tikis immediately succeed in controlling the masses and decide the most valuable thing on the island to steal is Donkey Kong's bananas. Donkey Kong, obviously pissed he just got robbed by some flying pieces of wood with hands, gets jumped by a tiki spawn camping who decides to try and hypnotize him as well. Plot Armor decides to step in when DK realizes he is apparently too stupid for the tiki to hypnotize him, so he immediately resorts to straight up violence and just starts wailing on him. After a little rage room experience with Donkey Kong, the adventure to save his precious food source has now officially begun. He will now have to travel through 8 distinct worlds, some familiar, some not to the DK Island, and reclaim his banana hoard from the giant sentient volcano thing. Pretty similar story to the first few games for sure. I still don't get why this banana hoard is so special in this universe. It's treated like literal gold, which is ironic because Mario's gold is practically meaningless in the same universe. But that's about the extent of the story up until World 7. I mean, the gameplay's gotta be fun enough to carry your interest all the way to that point anyway, so let's move on to the Gameplay and fun factor in Nintendo games is usually what their design philosophy tends to focus on when starting a new project. Retro seem to have picked this up very quickly with Metroid Prime and tried their best to refine their platforming gameplay as much as possible. And I am very happy to say they absolutely nailed Donkey Kong's moveset here. The roll mechanic is still one of the most fluid movements in any platformer I have ever seen to date. It's like the dive from 3D Mario. If you can master this mechanic, you could absolutely learn to speedrun this game. It even upgrades to an infinite roll when you have Diddy equipped. Another really satisfying move is the ability to use Diddy Kong's jetpack in really any situation. It provides a much larger safety net for those tight jumps and is incredibly balanced when using in game. The ground pound is a fun and satisfying move, but is really only useful for a few enemies, lots of secrets, and hitting these giant DK buttons. And of course, you have one of the most forgotten and unused abilities in any platformer ever, blowing. As a kid, I never used it once, but now that I know most of the puzzle pieces are locked behind these two moves, they do serve slightly more of a purpose, but funnily enough, they never brought blowing back in the sequel. I wonder why. Donkey Kong by himself, though, honestly has the perfect physics. He's not too floaty, but he's also not just a straight brick that falls after jumping a few feet. Retro was able to hit the perfect middle ground with his base physics, and I think that definitely contributes to the fun factor this game had. Retro had lots of different and interesting ideas, even if a few of them didn't stick very well. The animal buddies from the first few games also make a return, but they're kept pretty basic. And by them, I mean just Rambi, as he was the only one to return. Squawks is back in a different form as an item for Donkey Kong to buy in the shop in case you need help with finding puzzle pieces. But part of the reason for this change was because they just didn't have enough development time to add all these extra characters with their own unique levels and gameplay elements. In my eyes, Retro's compensation for this loss was to add lots of minecart and rocket barrel levels. Minecart levels had already been a staple of the Donkey Kong Country series since the first game, but rocket barrels are a completely uncharted territory, and they fit in with the Donkey Kong Country series perfectly. I couldn't even imagine a Donkey Kong game without rocket barrels anymore. They're all such cool levels with their own unique designs and themes. Even the music instruments change depending on the environment to make everything feel even more fresh. One of the main criticisms in terms of gameplay for Returns, though, is the unfortunate removal of underwater sections, which had been a staple of the Donkey Kong Country series since the first game. And with that said, it does unfortunately seep into the game design a little bit, and honestly makes World 2 feel pretty incomplete with some levels. Like they just needed a few underwater sections to make the beach stand out more from the rest of the game's worlds. Some sacrifices always have to be made in development though, and if it meant less time spent on Donkey Kong's base physics, then honestly I'd say the extra content was worth cutting to polish the core gameplay more. But making a strong and fluid moveset is only half the battle. Retro also had to find a way to make the level design complement the moveset that they created. Speaking of, level design has always been very hit or miss when it comes to Nintendo properties. Some games like New Super Mario Bros. Played it incredibly safe, while others like Super Mario Galaxy completely shook up the 3D platformer genre. Retro left no doubts for Returns being one of the strongest platformers in this category, and it's not even close. Not only are these levels way more memorable than 2D Mario levels, but they introduced even more mechanics in every level than Mario ever has. One of Retro's core design philosophies was to take 2 to 3 level ideas, slowly combine them together as the level progresses, and continue to challenge the player on those ideas throughout the level, so you would never get bored of doing the same platforming over and over or get bored of the bland layout. One of the ways they achieve this is by having different developers try to outdo each other in interesting level design, and then select the most fun or challenging sections created by individual developers and piece those elements into the level, like one giant puzzle they're putting together for each level. Some of my favorite levels in this game use this format incredibly well, such as 4-3 Bombs Away. This level begins with you realizing you are definitely not alone on this minecart ride, as a mole spots Donkey Kong and immediately starts chucking bombs in his path. This creates a very dynamic track throughout the level, level, while you're also trying to duck under giant crystal deposits. Eventually, the crystal deposits will start to crash down on the player and the track, creating even more tight jumps in your path. As you get farther into the level, the mole and crystal sections will continue to alternate, with the mole practically giving up on destroying the track and instead hurling every bomb he has at the crystals. Now the crystals are damaging the track, creating even more tight jumps. At the end of the level, the mole tries to throw every bomb he has at the track, but eventually meets the end of his own track. The final section of the level then shifts into a circular track that goes down a hill of crystals. The track then slowly breaks apart as the crystals destroy it until you reach the bottom of the hill. Definitely one of the most creative sections of the game by far. Another example of Retro's incredibly diverse level design would be in 7-2 Slam and Steel. This level begins with you dodging lots of different hydraulic presses, then shifting into dodging electric balls on conveyor belts. They then combine the hydraulic presses with the conveyor belts to add more difficulty. They go even further with the idea by adding giant hydraulic presses where you need to find the gaps or duck under electric fields to not be crushed. And finally, the last section involves hydraulic presses coming in from the sides as Donkey Kong climbs upwards towards the goal. My final example, ironically, just so happens to be from my least favorite world by far, but 2-5 Stormy Shore is one of the most unique levels in the game, and it's not even close. It starts off all nice and chill, you know, you're climbing through a cave with some fire beach music. There's some jellyfish and some squids to avoid, but overall a pretty chill level until holy sh**, that giant octopus just split that ship in half. The immediate music change also really reflects how dire the situation is as you jump from broken ship piece to broken ship piece. The octopus then starts chasing DK as the waves get higher, making jumps way harder to time. And now the octopus is destroying the ship pieces behind you if you're too slow. After you've done enough parkour, you reach the climbing section where the octopus is now trying to trick you into running into him as you climb in various directions. After this pretty sizable climbing section, you've reached the home stretch and just need to jump on a few more ship pieces to reach the final cannon. But don't wait too long or you're f***ed. And these are only 3 different examples. There's plenty more creative levels hidden throughout the game that I just don't have enough time to talk about here. But I also want anyone who is watching this who hasn't played the game yet for themselves to genuinely experience this game without me spoiling the whole thing, even if it's been out for 14 years. Retro has done absolutely everything they could to make sure this game was a fresh take on 2D platforming, which Nintendo was still trying to figure out with their premier platforming series at the time. When talking about bland level design and backgrounds, there's one series we can easily look at for what Retro tried not to do, and this series is New Super Mario Bros. NSMB is a very beloved series by many, and Mario Bros. Wii was my first video game ever. But we also gotta be real and take off the nostalgia goggles to see that the level design in New Super Mario Bros. Wii was pretty subpar. There is a lot of nuance to this though, and like anything else, people love this game for its ability to house 4 players with less chaos than later entries. But it also does ruin the level design to a degree, which I'll definitely make a video about at some point, but I'll briefly touch upon what's wrong with the game here. Many sections of this game are often very open and tend to repeat itself, like in 2-1, which first of all has one of the blandest backgrounds of all time, literally just stock image pyramids and a few cactuses. Nothing about this world screams Super Mario to me. But back to the level itself, so much of the level is just open space with no enemies in sight. The level also only really uses these sand geysers as the main platforming element, which is fine for 4 players, but it does make the level design far too open and forgettable to be enjoyable otherwise. Now again, this game was entirely built upon parading its simultaneous 4-player multiplayer. However, Retro also decided to add simultaneous multiplayer to Returns. So is it comparable to other platformer multiplayer experiences? Surprisingly, Returns was the first Donkey Kong Country game to introduce simultaneous multiplayer. In the SNES games, there were 2 players available, however you'd only switch off when you died or hit the switch player button. Returns finally broke that tradition, but it definitely has a few issues with some levels only being built for 1 player, which can make some segments feel impossible not to die in with 2 players. But at the same time, 90% of the levels don't have this issue and can be really enjoyable if you have the right people playing with you. Player 2 definitely has the advantage though, as they are are the ones that get the jetpack at all times, which requires player 1 to keep up as Donkey Kong, who has less loft and is tougher to play without Diddy Kong on your back. You can manually mount onto player 1 if you'd like though, which is a really nice counter when the level design is catering to a single player experience. Minecart and rocket barrels are really the only types of levels where this is a major problem, as now you have to share the vehicle, which can be like trying to share a car with someone. It just gets annoying after a while. Sure, you're both trying to get to the same place, but since you're both able to drive these vehicles, arguments can definitely happen on these stages if you're both trying to play at the same time. They even make both players duck and jump individually depending on the minecart level, which means someone might not be paying attention and cause both players to lose a life. Overall, the multiplayer creates an entirely different vibe to the game, which has been absolutely needed since the SNES games, and Retro absolutely nailed the multiplayer here for the most part. 2 players is the perfect number for tight platformers like DK and Cuphead, because as seen with the new Super Mario Bros. Series, when 4 players get involved, it requires the level design to center around fitting 4 players, which can create too many open spaces, which is great for a game like New Super Mario Bros. That prides itself on its multiplayer. But Donkey Kong's level design depth is just way too deep to have more than 2 players on the screen at a time. 9 out of 10 would recommend multiplayer for everyone who wants to experience this game with a friend, which is something I don't see talked about very much when other people discuss this game. Another thing people tend to skip over quite a bit when mentioning this game is the visuals. One of Retro's biggest strengths in development is that they're absolutely incredible at details and graphical optimization. Metroid Prime had already proved this time and time again with its ahead-of-the-time graphics, and in most instances, Donkey Kong Country Returns is an absolutely beautiful game. Sure, there's some things that need polishing and texture work, as this is still a Wii game at heart, but when going into NoClip, you can really see they did everything they could to make this game look better than the console it was on, which you really don't see in a lot of games these days. Game polishing is truly a lost art in modern gaming. This is mostly because the consoles are less restricted than ever, so it's easier to get away with less polish and compression, which puts more brute force on the console running it. But even now, Retro is still incredible with their graphics and polishing, with the Metroid Prime remaster looking like the best graphical showcase on the Switch, period. Especially with the new silhouette levels in Returns being a straight up graphical showcase for the beautiful backgrounds Retro can create on a literal souped up GameCube. I even made the jungle silhouette level my computer background because of how beautiful it looks. These levels have become another huge part of Donkey Kong Country's identity as a platformer, which, look at that, Nintendo decided to use silhouette levels in Mario Wonder. They really did hear the feedback from fans about New Super Mario Bros. Series' lack of variety and immediately went to their cousin series and copied their homework. Speaking of copying other people's homework, we should probably talk about the situation involving the soundtrack. Surprisingly, David Wise didn't make a return for this game, and from my research, I couldn't really find a good answer as to why either. I get the fact that it was a reboot, so maybe they wanted to try something new and see what would fit the new style better, but after playing Tropical Freeze, which did bring back David Wise, I much prefer him as the composer for the entire Donkey Kong series, to be honest. It's not that the soundtrack is bad or anything, far from it. There are some absolute hidden gems within Return's soundtrack, but at the end of the day, most songs are just remixes and remakes of David Wise's tracks. David Wise somehow brings his own charm into the Donkey Kong series, which made some of the newer songs or even the remixes fall a little more flat when being interpreted into the modern day. I would have loved if David Wise could have at least overseen the production of these remixes, but at the very least, I still cherish most of these songs within the soundtrack as great modern renditions to Rare's old themes. Some of my favorites include King of Kling, Palm Tree Groove, Tidal Terror, Rickety Rails, Forest Frenzy, Treetop Rock, Sticky Situation, Northern Hemisphere, Fear Factory, Gear Getaway, Life in the Mines, and Smoky Peak are all amazing songs and remixes that still have the charm of David Wise's original renditions. But you see how I didn't include any of the boss themes though? Let's finally talk about the bosses. Nintendo is one of those companies that have a pretty iffy track record when it comes to their platforming bosses. Unfortunately, Retro did continue this trend, and while I don't have the time to talk about all the bosses in depth in this video, I will be making another video going more in depth with the levels and the bosses in the future, but I'll briefly touch upon them here. The bosses in this game have a very wide spectrum of pros and cons. At the very least, I can say they're all very unique in their own right, with some bosses being almost perfect with really fun mechanics and platforming challenges, while others feel incredibly bland, monotonous, and too short. Especially the second half of the bosses just feel incredibly incomplete with their movesets and phases. I think part of the reason I criticize the second half of the bosses more is because the earlier bosses get more of a pass for being easy and simple since it's the very beginning of the game, but it just feels like these bosses never evolve in depth as the game progresses, except for World 6, but it's literally just a refight of World 1's boss, but way better with a ton of upgrades to the original. Every other unique boss to add to the second half of the game still feels just as easy as the first half, except for this flying fucker, but we'll get to him eventually. Even the final boss was incredibly easy and simple to figure out, which Nintendo final bosses have always been this way, but it's still a really disappointing payoff and sad to see Retro fell down the same path. The reason you're allowed to get away with difficulty at the end of a game is because players have already sunk tons of hours into the game, and they wouldn't quit at the end if it was too difficult because they already committed to beating the game. I feel like a lot of developers at Nintendo and Retro don't realize how committed people can be if they're already at the home stretch of completing a goal. The entire final world in general is honestly just a terrible payoff for a game that had incredible momentum going into World 8. So as with any Nintendo game, I don't feel like it's fair to just drop the score because of the final boss, because every Nintendo game has this problem. Now that doesn't mean it should be an excuse for this huge issue, but Retro did a great job at fixing this in the next game. But in Return specifically, it was something that bogged down the experience in the late game just a bit. At the end of every great story, usually what will stick with you is the beginning and the end the most. And they absolutely did an amazing job with the beginning of the game. One of the best opening worlds I have ever seen in any platformer. However, they did botch the ending to some extent, and that is disappointing. But to be objective, you have to talk about the negatives of a game just as much as the positives, because at the end of the day, there will never be a perfect game out there. But I've rambled enough about my distaste for the endgame, and will definitely go more in depth about the bosses and level design in my world ranking video. But this video has already gotten pretty long, and I think we should end this video on a positive note. Donkey Kong Country Returns, regardless of my criticisms, is still one of the most well-designed platformers of all time, and was a giant leap forward for Donkey Kong. Is it disappointing that the payoff of the entire adventure was subpar? For sure, but does that just negate all of the amazing things Retro accomplished here though? I don't think so. From the fresh take on platforming as DK, to the unbelievably well-designed movement showing inspiration from Rare's original moveset is still faithfully intact. The shift from the SNES games to Returns honestly feels very satisfying because of how faithful the game felt while adding its own original flair to the mix. The level design also feels incredibly fresh and exciting with new environments and mechanics added to every single level. The design philosophy of this game was also incredibly strong for the first game in the rebooted series. Even creating series staples like the Rocket Barrel levels is quite a feat for Retro's first 2D platformer. The graphical wonders Retro was able to produce on a system that couldn't even support HDMI shouldn't be understated either. They were incredibly committed to making this the most faithful revival possible in so many different avenues. Returns, just like Metroid Prime, became a huge love letter to the Donkey Kong Country series that Rare started 16 years prior. I truly hope that when this game comes to the Switch, it becomes a breakout success that gets even more people into the Donkey Kong Country series as a whole, because of how much love and care was put into this platformer that not a lot of people tend to talk about. And that about wraps up this video. If y'all enjoyed, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to invest in more content like this. And let me know what y'all think about Donkey Kong Country in the comments. I'd love to see what y'all's opinions are on the series. With that, peace out, y'all.